I call Jan Logley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's with pleasure I rise to speak to the Social Worker Mandatory Registration Amendment Bill that's been put forward by Labour's Carmel Sepuloni, and congratulations to that member for getting this drawn. And it is a bill whose time is well and truly overdue, and the Green Party is very pleased to offer our support to this bill. While I stand, though, I do feel compelled to address some of the arguments that I think I understood from the last speaker, though it was a little bit unclear to me exactly what the main point of that speech was, because I was hearing on one hand that skill sets are really important. And that's, if we're looking at ensuring safety and good social change in our communities, then we need our social workers to have the skill sets. Well, actually, that's part of what this bill's about, because social worker registration is the oversight and the assurance of skills and ethics within the social work system. But I also heard from that member, kind of contrary to that, was that actually what we need to be doing to solve our social problems is it's not looking at social workers at all, it's actually signing the TPPA. Because that's going to solve all our social problems. Well, news to that minister, we've signed quite a few free trade agreements over the years, and somehow our social problems have not dissolved. It does not seem to be that simple. And actually there is a place for registration. And we heard from the member, Alfred Naro, earlier that, well, government can't support this bill because while they agree with significant amounts of the content of this bill, they're doing a review. So they don't want to hear from the public to help inform that review, which actually sending this to Select Committee would enable. I really do question the logic of that. If the government is interested in this and they say it's on their agenda, then support it to Select Committee. Enable the public, enable unregistered social workers, enable registered social workers to comment on this bill. There was one specific point in the content that I heard challenged by the member Alfred Naro, and that was the transition time of 1 year, and pointing out that initially back in 2003 when the initial bill that did not bring in mandatory registration was brought in, that Steve Mahari said it needed 6 to 8 years transition. We are 12 years on, and surely that's not enough reason to block this bill. If that was your only point of difference, let it go to Select Committee and argue that point. Change the transition time. I personally do think that maybe it's somewhere in between, that there is a degree of urgency on this, but maybe 1 year to register the 3,000 unregistered people who are practicing at the moment may be too short, and we should have that public discussion. And yes, there are issues to consider with this, because we know that our community organisations' funding has been deeply squeezed by our government while they're having to deal with more and more complex cases, that Child, Youth and Family is referring to these community agencies. And with that funding being squeezed, there is a real danger that they're increasingly going to start using unregistered social workers because they may not feel they can afford registered social workers, and the increased costs that would be associated with this bill in that locked funding environment may be detrimental to them. But surely our priority is our children and is the people who are using these services, and the importance of us making sure that they have a body that they can complain to if something goes wrong, that they can be sure that when they are dealing with the social worker, that that person is a social worker who has been trained, who has a code of ethics that they are working to, which is what comes with being a registered social worker. And there have been all too many stories of unregistered social workers who have not been able to be monitored and whose behaviour has been out of line. In 2003, my colleague Sue Bradford said that the underlying question of that bill was, do we as a society want to begin the process of professionalising social work in a positive and empowering way? 12 years on, to me, the answer is still yes, and registration is the way.